I want to preface this episode by talking a little bit about what's going on right now. As I'm recording this, Minneapolis is burning. This is not lost on me. I understand the rage and the pain that causes that. For those of us that are not able to be there and on the ground and are processing this news from afar and seeing the images of another brutal murder of a Black person, I hope that this episode allows you and us to assess how we can begin our own healing journey and implement practices that help us to cope. Because we all deserve to heal. Black people deserve to heal. Hello, and welcome to the first episode of the Light of the Darkness podcast. I'm your host, Erin Edwards. In this episode, I have a conversation with Rebekah Ferguson, a licensed mental health counselor based in the New York City area. Rebekah is a trauma-informed psychotherapist who believes in the healing and transformative aspect of sharing stories of pain. In our conversation, we discuss the stigma that exists in the Black community around mental health. We discuss access issues or barriers to care. And we also touch on some healthy coping strategies that could help us all. And following my conversation with Rebekah, there will be a short mindful moment led by Ebony Medas, a licensed mental health counselor based in New York City. Okay, let's get started. Welcome, Rebekah, to the Light Up the Darkness podcast. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start out with you introducing yourself. So can you tell us a little bit about your work?
Yes, no, absolutely. First of all, thank you, Erin, for having me. I'm a licensed mental health counselor in the New York City area. I work in a community mental health clinic, and I also have a private practice. And if I would think of 3 words that describes me, or my work, I would say definitely trauma informed, definitely coming from a lens of, that especially for marginalized people, for marginalized folks, for Black folks, really having like a racialized lens to therapy, just being aware of racial trauma. And then I think just the unconditional humanness that all of us have, and just positive regard and acceptance for that are 3 major tenets that inform my practice.
Awesome. Thank you for that. So let's just jump right into this conversation. Today, I want to talk a little bit about the Black community and the stigma that exists around acknowledging mental health issues. And the reason we're here and the reason I'm doing this podcast is to help kind of break down that stigma. So one of the things that I have personally experienced and that I know to be true for many other people is the access to mental health care being a challenge. Affordability is one of the things that gets in the way of seeking care, like paying for a therapist. Can you speak to some of these barriers and maybe offer some insight into what challenges people might face?
Absolutely. Yes. So certainly when it comes to access, there are several major barriers, community stigma being a huge one. Research studies and, research studies along with just anecdotal experience from myself, and members of my community and my family. And I'm sure you've experienced the same, where in our communities, a lot of times, going to see a therapist or going to see a psychiatrist is viewed as this word crazy in social circles, and just discussions about mental illness is not necessarily something that is appropriate or that happens in families. So definitely community stigma continues to be an issue. Besides that, I also think systematically a lot of health clinics do get federal funding, but there's definitely not enough funding towards mental health in this country. And that, just the same way that other issues with lack of funding affect our community more, this also is true for mental health. And so it becomes more difficult for people to access affordable services. And if they do access those services, sometimes they're not readily available. There's, a significant delay between, from when they can start. A lot of people who are uninsured, and we're thinking about immigrant populations, a lot of people are afraid to access care because they are afraid of a huge hospital bill, or they're afraid that it may affect their status if they're trying to, become a U.S. citizen. So there's just so many issues that affect marginalized people in a way that is not really seen, or acknowledged on a broad scale, because it doesn't affect everyone the same way. Another huge problem is representation. There are statistics that show that only 6.2% of psychologists and 5.6% of advanced practice psychiatric nurses, 12.6% of social workers, and 21.3% of psychiatrists are members of minority groups. So that's also a problem.
Wow.
I think, generally speaking, people that aren't minorities, if you're a white man or if you're a white woman, you can easily walk into a clinic or hospital and see someone that looks like you and have a certain level of comfort that person may have certain shared lived experiences and not really have to worry about certain things that, are taken for granted. And so I would say definitely community stigma, access, or lack of access in just regards to availability of services, and then affordability of it, and then also representation in the field.
Yeah. That's crucial. I've experienced that myself in my search for a therapist. I want someone who can kind of understand all the stuff that I don't really want to talk about, things that affect me as a Black woman in America. And it's hard to find a therapist who's a woman of color. Yeah.
Yes. No, absolutely. And I have also experienced that. I have accessed therapy in the past, and I think that, there's multiple modalities of therapy, right? There's cognitive behavioral therapy, there's psychodynamic, there's dialectical behavior therapy, but none of those approaches are going to matter without kind of this fundamentally understanding, right, of what it is to be Black, or a marginalized group in this country. It's really difficult to actually feel a meaningful connection and to talk about some microaggressions and just other issues that are lived day-to-day experiences, without, because you can't CBT that away. Those, you can't those aren't thinking errors. You can't there's no rationalize, so there's just a different approach that has to be taken. And sometimes that's also an issue often.
I just want to mention that there may be some acronyms and terms that you're using that the general population may not understand. For example, CBT.
Yes.
Would you mind explaining what that is?
Absolutely. So CBT is a treatment modality. It stands for cognitive behavior therapy. And the main foundation of cognitive behavioral therapy is this premise that, and I'm oversimplifying because I'm summarizing, but the main premise is that it's the connection between how we think, and then how that affects our feelings on an emotional and physiological level, like what our feelings do. And then also, so it's the connection between our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors, right? So it's kind of like this triangle where there's, for the whatever problem is presented in treatment, the approach is kind of, using, it's questioning, your interpretation of it, and
Mm-hmm.
if that's affecting how you're feeling it, and taking in the situation, and if that's affecting what behavior you then do as a result of it. Which, and don't get me
Mm-hmm.
wrong, like cognitive behavioral therapy, or as I like CBT, definitely has its place. But when you bring that approach to issues in our community without the context and the historical knowledge and the historical lived
Mm-hmm.
experience, it's not going to land. It's not going to hit the same way. And so what ends up happening is a lot of people then don't come back to treatment, because
Right.
what the feeling is left with, okay, this person doesn't get it. And then it's not the
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
responsibility of a person seeking treatment to necessarily explain or educate their therapist on those things. That's not what they're there for. They're not there to teach or to do that type
Yeah.
of labor. So they don't
Yeah.
come back, and which is completely
Yeah.
understandable.
Yeah. And so that becomes another barrier or
Mm-hmm.
challenge. Yeah.
Right.
So, so if you're speaking to someone who is going through some of these challenges, like they can't find a therapist, they can't afford a therapist, or just looking for a way that they can manage their mental health, what are some solutions to like bypass some of these challenges that people can access? Like, do you have any suggestions for that?
I think I mean, I have to say, if this is like a crisis situation, I think, the ultimate goal is to have someone be safe. And if it is a
Right.
crisis, they're like, there's like 24/7 lifelines and suicide prevention hotlines, national ones.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if it's not this like crisis level situation, there are also a lot of books. There's a lot of like if someone cannot afford therapy, a great start to kind of being on this journey of trying to heal is like things like journaling or accessing certain self-help
Mm-hmm.
books that are written by Black people. The whole point of
Mm-hmm.
therapy, in a summary, is to kind of, identify problematic patterns that have been coming up in life. And by problematic, I don't mean necessarily something that someone else said, hey, you need to work on this. It's just more like our own knowledge of ourselves and things that may keep showing up for us that we need more clarity on. And so, I'll use myself as an example. Far before I accessed therapy services, my aunt got me a journal, and it sat there, and I didn't use it for years. And when I finally did start using it, it was very therapeutic. It was very healing, because the
Mm-hmm.
thing that journaling can do is it gives you a chance to kind of like observe your thoughts and observe what's going on in your head in a way that you don't do on a day-to-day basis, because like that's just not
Yes.
how we work. And so
Yeah.
I really think journaling is a good tool for that.
I
There's also,
I
yeah, go
I
ahead.
just want to chime in. I
Yeah.
actually agree. I completely agree with you on that, but something so funny happened today. I was searching for something for my daughter, and I found like an old journal packed away from almost like over 10 years ago. And I was just looking through it, and outside of the cringeworthy aspects of it, I found an entry that was I wrote because I had just started seeing a therapist, and
Mm-hmm.
I wrote in it that I'm writing in this and in this journal because the therapist at the time suggested that I write out my feelings. And I had like a few entries after that also related to whatever I was feeling. I was going through like a period of loss and grief at the time.
Mm.
Um and reading that today was like, wow, I was like, oh my gosh. It like brought me back to that place, but I also felt a lot of gratitude, like that I actually was able to do that, and I think it helped me. I really believe it helped me through that moment in life.
Absolutely.
It was life changing.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. It's so funny what looking back at, right, like journals from like years ago or like a decade ago. And it, yeah, I agree with you. I
Yeah.
think there is, because it kind of also allows you to see like periods of growth from where you were back then, right? And just like how you
Yeah.
view life and perspectives on things.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
so
it was very interesting.
But
So,
so you
yeah.
started journaling too. You started journaling in a place when you were like going through it. Like it kind of was
Yeah.
brought up. Yeah, and that's common with a lot of people. And I think for me, that's also, um, that's when I started journaling too, was because it was was going through like a big life transition. It was like the summer before, like when I was going to college. So it's a lot of times people start journaling because of that, which is
Hmm.
nice and it's helpful. But to answer your question, I would definitely say journaling. I also think, if accessing therapy is completely out of the question, there are so many workshops. Even the place that for instance, like my private practice, it's closed now because of this pandemic that we're in. But I feel I want to mention this space because I think when we talk about healing, and especially for like, for Black communities, there's a really
Hmm.
amazing wellness workshop in Brooklyn called Heal House. And even if someone's not ready to access like one-on-one individual therapy or couples or family counseling, there's so many workshops that are centered around grounding and mindfulness and just like, healing trauma. And these are workshops. This is healing that's done, it's facilitated by, 1 to 3 people, and the workshops are community centered. So that's nice because a person then can participate as much or as little as they want to. And by participate, I mean as far as just sharing or talking. So there are other ways. There's workshops, there's self-help books, there's journaling. Um, you know, and some people don't believe or or practice yoga, but I personally found yoga also very helpful for me, only because it was challenging. It was not the nice, relaxing experience that I thought it was going to be. Um, and I don't use these as a substitute for therapy. I'm saying if therapy is not accessible, that sometimes these other practices can kind of help us plug into that
Hmm.
like space between our thoughts where we can actually observe our thoughts and like know what's going on. For me, I started doing yoga when
Hmm.
I first moved to New York City. Um, Super stressed out, super anxious, and it was a nice way for me to plug into like those like the space in between all of my anxious thoughts and really just get a feeling of being a little bit more centered. And from there,
Yeah.
then I would like journal. And so, I think establishing some type of like practice like that is extremely helpful.
Yeah, I agree with that. Um, so I kind of want to shift the conversation a little bit
Mm-hmm.
to like I know we discussed medication like when we spoke on the phone, but
Mm-hmm.
what I I think there is like I personally have negative feelings when it comes to medication. I'm not gonna lie. I barely take Advil, you know? So
Mm.
like there to me it's just like how I know that it helps some people manage their mental health. Like is there anything you want people to know about using medication to manage their mental health?
I want people to know that mental health and mental health challenges in general often happen on a spectrum, meaning sometimes the symptoms are intermittent, sometimes they are, fleeting, sometimes they're because of transitional life stages. So, because I do think with the stigma, there's kind of like, oh, if you see a therapist, then you have this diagnosis. So it means all of these things. And the same with medication. There are people who run to like who I've seen in my practice who who like want medication because let's say they're going through a very normal human experience because they've had a recent loss. And they want to take the pain of the loss away. And so like, you know, it really talking to people about whether or not it's appropriate, right? Like whether or not it's appropriate for them right now to seek out medication services, or if it's more about like trying to learn how to move through the grieving process and tolerating difficult feelings without wanting to medicate it. So I am not I'm a licensed mental health counselor, so I'm not like, it's outside of my scope of practice. I'm not trained to provide medication services, but there are people that, I'm required to assess and diagnose and refer to medication management or to psychiatry. And it's done on a very case by case basis. There's people who, like you said, are going to need medication just to be able to function or to be able to be stabilized. But I do think any medication has to be a super collaborative effort between the person taking it and their provider. And I think there needs to be so much communication, not only amongst the provider and the person taking it, but also like any loved ones, whether it's a family member or a close friend, because sometimes those people can notice things or have some really like insightful input that maybe the person who's taking the medication doesn't have. We do know for like severe and like more chronic and like persistent mental health challenges like schizophrenia and bipolar, schizoaffective disorder, that like medication is indicated and often in in an ongoing way. But there are people with like major depressive disorder or generalized anxiety disorder, or even like PTSD, like post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, or any kind of like trauma reaction that may need to take medication. But the idea is not that this is an ongoing lifelong thing for people, with depression or anxiety or PTSD. In some cases, sure, but in the majority of the cases, it's about, being in therapy and trying to learn tools and also what they're doing outside of therapy. Do you know what? Like that really, really, really does matter. There's an amazing book by this woman, Ruth White. She's she has has her doctorate degree. She's a Black woman. And she actually writes about her struggles with bipolar disorder and talks about how she prevents relapse. And she really stresses like the physical health aspect of it and the stress management aspect of it and kind of like the preventative steps. And so it's I guess to answer your question, I do think we're in a culture and in a society where medication, we kind of, there's this concept of it kind of fixing everything. And there's no medication prescribed that's going to do that. At best, these medications are prescribed in combination with like, individual therapy and trying to improve like, social circles and supports and, really trying to see if there's an element of spirituality that can help. And so it's always a combination factor. It's never just about the medication or the prescription.
Thank you for that. That was really helpful. And you gave a lot of resources that I'm going to have to get from you later so I can include them in the episode notes.
Yes. No problem. Sure.
Yeah. So this podcast is here because Black people deserve to heal too. And I want you in your own words to describe what is the one thing you want people to know about healing from mental health challenges in general? Like, what is the one thing you would say?
That it's possible and it happens. And a lot of that is through sharing stories and like naming untruths, like I like to call them, like untruths that we've been told and unspokens, sharing those stories. And it is possible. I really think people need to know that it does happen. And it's a process. It's not a one shot deal. It's kind of like it's a process. Yes. That's way more than one thing, but that's what I would say.
No, I love that. It's a process and it's possible. People.
Yes.
Yeah. That's awesome.
times.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Oh
no,
my God.
thank you. I love this. Oh my God, I love the name of your podcast too. I remember you told me it, and then when you
Thank
mentioned
you.
it again tonight, I was just like, oh my God, that's right. That's amazing and perfect.
I want to give a big thank you to Rebekah Ferguson for being a part of the first episode of the Light Up the Darkness podcast and sharing such helpful information that I think could help us all. And now we've reached the mindful moment segment of the episode. Today's mindful moment is led by Ebony Medas. She's a licensed mental health counselor, also based in New York City, and she's been practicing psychotherapy since 2009. She's also a certified master instructor in integrated energy therapy and a level 2 Reiki practitioner. Okay, so if you're able to, I ask that you just sit in a comfortable position and try to participate if you can. You can press pause whenever you need to, and I hope that this mindful moment is helpful and healing.
Taking a mindful moment can serve as a great opportunity for you to check in with your feelings. For each intense emotion you experience, it can be helpful to pause and ask yourself a few questions. The following prompts can be used to guide you through this exploratory process. I typically have my clients start out by asking, what is this feeling trying to tell me? This is a great starting point to begin the processing around why certain things may be coming up for you. Next, you want to ask, how does this emotion make me want to act? Specifically paying attention to your gut reaction and making a note of it. Because feelings and emotion can manifest within our body, it's important to also ask and explore, how does it feel in my physical body? For example, am I noticing any changes to my breath, or do I feel tension in certain parts of my body as I'm experiencing this different feeling and emotion? What does this emotion make me feel about myself? Then to round up this process and to get you to begin thinking about some tools and strategies that can support you through this moment is, what are some options for healthy expression of this emotion? So how can I experience it in a way that serves me better? I hope that these prompts can be used to support you in processing the challenging thoughts and feelings as they come up for you.
All right, that concludes the very first episode of the Light Up the Darkness podcast. I want to thank my two guests, Rebekah Ferguson and Ebony Medas, for taking the time to be a part of this episode. I want to thank the artist Solange Quarshi for developing and creating the cover art that you see for the podcast. And finally, a big thank you to Camille Shannon for composing the music you will hear at the beginning of each episode. I hope that you tune in for future episodes. There will be more. So stay tuned and stay well.